It's crazy how times change. When Abraham Lincoln was president, people made fun of him for being awkward and ugly. Half of the country thought he was a tyrant. He was actually even very unpopular up in the north. And now, he's considered iconic and legendary, one of the most beloved presidents in American history. But Lincoln's life was full of ups and downs. He loved to tell a story about how he got onto a train one day, and a man came up to him and said, "Sir, I believe I have something for you." And Lincoln quizzically looked at him and said, "Now, what might that be?" The man pulled a pocket knife out of his pants pocket, and he said, "A long time ago, a man gave me this pocket knife and said I was to keep it until I found a man uglier than myself. And today, I believe I have. This, sir, belongs to you." And he handed him the pocket knife. Stuff like this happened to Lincoln all the time. One day he was at a social party, which many times he found quite awkward for him. And one lady commented on how homely he was. That's a word for very unattractive. And he said, "Madam, there's nothing I can do about that." But she wittily quipped, "Well, you could do us all a favor and stay home." This was the kind of thing Lincoln got a lot. And somehow the abuse and the rejection of popular society gave him a strength that several of his predecessors, who were more good-looking and more accepted, just didn't have. You see, they were used to being loved by everyone, so they wanted to keep that up. And Lincoln, well, he was used to being the odd man out. And that kept him on track for always doing the right thing, or for at least trying to do the right thing. There was a time towards the beginning of his presidency when he was talking to a friend, and he was sitting on a little footstool. And can you imagine Lincoln sitting on a footstool? His knees were about as tall as his shoulders, and he was sitting there, and he was all elbows and arms. And the friend that he was talking to was asking him about being president, and if he felt like he was equipped and ready for it, since over half the country thought that he wasn't and was leaving the country because of him. And he said, "I would be a, quote, presumptuous blockhead," end quote. "I would be a presumptuous blockhead if I thought I could do this by myself." And then he talked about how he would have to lean heavily on God's wisdom and his providential care to do a good job. You see, Lincoln's humility led him to not only turn to God for help, but it also kept him accessible to people. One day in New York, this was while he was running for office, he went into a kind of a rough part of town, and people said, "Don't go in there, it's a dangerous part of town." But he did it anyway, and there was a school in session, and he went into the school room, and he just kind of sat in the back, and he was just enjoying watching the kids learn. And the teacher saw him, and she kind of assumed he was someone important from the way he was dressed, and she finished her lesson and said, "Kind sir, would you like to come to the front of the class and share something?" And Lincoln's like, "Well, okay." And he went up to the front, and the school teacher described the magical charisma Lincoln had. Here's a complete stranger walking in front of a bunch of kids, and as soon as he spoke, they were riveted. She said when he would get to a sad part of the story, they would lean forward in their chairs and their faces just looked so sad. But then when we would come to a happy part, they would burst out laughing. And several times he tried to stop and say, "All right, I'm done, I'm gonna go." But the kids just shouted, go on, more, we want more." And that happened 3 or 4 times before he finally left. You see, Lincoln's gift wasn't his body or his face. It was something that was from his heart, because when he spoke, was magic. There's a New Yorker who told a story about Lincoln stepping up to give a speech in New York City. And when Lincoln got up, the way he was dressed and even the way he said, "Mr. Chairman," the New Yorker was like, okay, this might work in the Wild West of Illinois, but it is not going to work here in New York City. We are way too sophisticated for this kind of homespun, log splitter kind of guy. But then he said Lincoln started to speak. And at first he was distracted. His voice just wasn't the voice of an orator. But then once Lincoln got into his speech, this New Yorker was just carried away. He said his arm movements were graceful, and his face just lit up. And as he went through his speech, I found myself just losing myself in the speech. And at the end of the speech, this New Yorker said, I was screaming and cheering like a wild Indian. That's the gift that Lincoln had. Now, we've all got gifts. And some of the gifts that we have are cheered and accepted by our society. I mean, all of us would love to have the gift of gorgeous looks. We would love to have the gift of muscular, toned bodies. We would love to have the gift of being able to make money at the drop of a hat. But some of us don't have those gifts. One of the cool things about God is at the end of your life, when you meet him, he's not going to judge you hard if you don't have the awesome gifts. He's just going to ask you one question. What did you do with the gift that I gave you? Yesterday I heard a story and he was talking about the feeding of the 5,000 from the little boy's lunch. But the pastor, he took a unique perspective because he said, the mother of that little boy, her gift was to make a lunch for her child. And that's such a mundane, normal, talentless gift. But she did it. And she was faithful with that little lunch. And that little boy's gift was to share it with Andrew. And Andrew gave it to Jesus. And Jesus multiplied it and fed a crowd of over 5,000 people. And one day, God's going to look at that mother and say, what did you do with your gift? And she's going to say, well, I made a lunch. It's not much. And he's going to say, I took your little gift of a lunch and I fed over 1,000 people. You see, we need to stop worrying about getting the right gifts. And we just need to use the gifts that we have. Lincoln didn't have the gift of attractiveness. He didn't have the gift of suave, debonair manners, but he had the gift of character. He had the gift of leadership. He had the gift of never giving up. And even though he went through a ton of failures, basically his whole life was a lot of failures. Even in his presidency, tons of failures. He gave his gifts to God over and over and over. And in his life, he was able to see a small portion of how his gifts were changing the world. But now we can look back and we're like, whoa, blown away by his gifts. And it's the same thing with you. Don't worry if you don't have the rock star gifts. Use the little ones that you have. Give them to God. Over time, they'll build up. And one day, you might look back on your life and be amazed at what God has accomplished through your small gifts. So today, make that lunch. Talk to those school kids. Remember that you would be an obnoxious blockhead to think that you could do great things in life without God's help. So look up to him. Thank him for the gifts that he's given you, whether they're awesome or small in your sight. He gave you those gifts because he knows you can change the world with your gift. You're going to do great things. God is proud of you, and he's got a plan for you, and he gave you the perfect gift for the perfect time. And if you don't know what to do, just look up, because God's got this. God bless.